My dad called me a failure and cut me off. Then he discovered my worthless art sells for $200K per piece. My dad threw my portfolio in the fireplace. I watched 3 years of work curl into ash while he said I was dead to him. This wasn't a metaphor or an angry threat. He meant it literally. He called security to escort me out of his office building, changed every lock I had keys to, and told my mother that speaking my name in his house would result in immediate divorce. I was 23, holding 2 garbage bags of clothes, and I had $70 in my checking account. The art burning happened because I'd told him I was dropping out of Wharton's MBA program. I'd lasted 18 months in business school before realizing I spent every lecture sketching in the margins instead of taking notes. My professors noticed. One pulled me aside and said I was wasting a slot someone else deserved, that my heart clearly wasn't in corporate strategy. He was right. My heart was in the charcoal drawings I made at 3 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. In the oil paintings I hid in my closet because my dad had made it clear that art was for people who couldn't hack real careers. When I tried explaining this to him, he asked how much artists make. I said it varied wildly. He looked up average salaries on his phone and read them aloud with disgust. $38,000 a year for fine artists, $22,000 for freelance illustrators starting out. He ran a commercial real estate empire worth $300 million. The idea of his son making less than his secretary was apparently worse than having no son at all. He said I was choosing poverty and failure over legacy and power, that I'd regret this when I was starving in some rat-infested studio. Then he grabbed my portfolio off his desk and walked to the fireplace in his office. I begged him not to do it. Those weren't just drawings. They were applications for art residencies, pieces I'd spent months perfecting, my only chance at getting into serious galleries. He opened the leather case and pulled out my charcoal study of my grandmother before she died. I'd drawn it from memory, trying to capture how she looked when she told stories, that specific tilt of her head. He held it over the flames and asked if I was ready to stop this nonsense and go back to Wharton. I said no, because I couldn't pretend anymore. He dropped it, and it caught immediately. One by one, he burned 15 pieces. My hands shook, watching them blacken and curl. My oil painting of the Philadelphia skyline at dawn. My ink drawings of hands in different positions, my watercolor series about isolation that I'd actually sold 2 pieces from to a small gallery in Brooklyn. Everything gone in under 3 minutes. When the portfolio was empty, he threw the leather case in too. He said that was my future burning, that I'd chosen this, and I should remember it was my fault when I ended up homeless. Security escorted me out through the parking garage so none of his employees would see. I sat in my 10-year-old Civic that was still registered in my dad's name and realized he'd probably report it stolen soon. I drove to my apartment near campus, but my roommate texted that my dad's lawyer had already called the landlord. My name wasn't on the lease because Dad had been paying my rent directly. I had until end of day to clear out. I packed everything I owned into garbage bags and called my girlfriend Stephanie. She said her parents wouldn't let me stay with them because my dad had called and told them I was having a mental breakdown. My younger brother Ethan texted me around midnight. He said Dad had gathered the whole family and announced I'd made my choice. No one was allowed to contact me or help me in any way. Mom had cried, but agreed. Ethan was 17 and terrified of Dad, so he couldn't risk helping either. He said he was sorry and that he hoped I figured things out. Then he blocked my number because Dad checked his phone regularly. I sat in my car in a Walmart parking lot reading that text over and over, understanding that my entire support system had evaporated in 6 hours. I slept in my car that first night with everything I owned piled in the back seat. The next morning I drove to a coffee shop and used their Wi-Fi to look for jobs. I had no degree now, no references because all my internships had been at my dad's company, and no permanent address. I applied to 43 jobs that day: restaurant server, retail associate, warehouse worker, anything that was hiring immediately. I got 3 responses asking for addresses and references. By day 3, I was rationing protein bars and refilling my water bottle at gas station bathrooms. I finally got a job at a call center that paid $11 an hour. The orientation was 2 days long and unpaid, but they said I'd start regular shifts after. I showed up every day in the same clothes, washing them in gas station sinks at night. The other trainees noticed, but no one said anything. On my second day, my car got towed from the apartment complex parking lot where I'd been sleeping. My dad had reported it stolen, just like I'd thought. I couldn't afford the impound fees, so I lost the car and everything in the back seat I hadn't carried into orientation. When I showed up late on day 3 because I'd had to walk 4 miles, the supervisor said I was clearly unreliable and they couldn't offer me the position. I stood in that fluorescent-lit break room and felt something crack inside my chest. I was homeless, Carlos, and nobody would hire me because I looked and smelled like someone who slept outside. I walked to the public library and locked myself in a bathroom stall and cried for the first time since my dad had burned my art. The library became my base. I could use computers, charge my phone, stay warm, and use the bathroom. I taught myself to clean up in the sinks well enough that I didn't look obviously homeless. I kept my situation quiet and spent hours applying for jobs, researching emergency housing, and trying to figure out how to survive. At night, I slept in a park downtown under a pavilion where other homeless people gathered. Some of them were kind. An older veteran named Raymond showed me which churches had free meals on which days. A woman named Alice told me about a day labor place that paid cash. The day labor kept me alive. I'd show up at 5 in the morning and get picked for construction cleanup or warehouse loading. The work was brutal, and they paid minimum wage in cash, no overtime, no breaks that weren't legally required. But it was something. I saved every dollar I could, eating 1 meal a day at the church that served dinner. After 2 weeks, I had enough for a week at an extended stay motel. I paid in cash and got a room that smelled like mold and cigarettes. For 1 week, I had a bed and a shower and a door that locked. It felt like luxury. During those motel days, I bought a cheap sketchbook and pencils at a dollar store. I couldn't not draw. It was like breathing, something I needed to survive. I sketched the other residents at the motel, the exhausted mother with 3 kids in one room, the older man who sat outside chain-smoking, the night clerk who studied community college textbooks between guests. I captured their faces and bodies with an accuracy that surprised me. Without formal instruction, I'd developed my own style over years of secret practice. I could see the weight of people's lives in how they held their shoulders, in the lines around their eyes. One of the motel residents saw me drawing. Her name was Veronica, and she managed a vintage clothing store downtown. She looked at my sketchbook and said I had real talent. I told her the brief version of my situation, and she offered me a job at her store. Minimum wage but steady hours, and she'd let me keep art supplies in the back room. I started the next day. Veronica was in her 50s, covered in tattoos, and she'd walked away from her own wealthy family 30 years ago. She understood what it meant to be cut off. The store was in a trendy neighborhood full of galleries and coffee shops. I worked 6 days a week, helping customers and organizing inventory. With steady income, I rented a tiny studio apartment in a rough neighborhood. The building had roaches and the heat barely worked, but it was mine. No one could take it away because my dad didn't know about it. I bought a used mattress off Craigslist and ate ramen most nights. Every spare dollar went to art supplies. I painted in the few hours I wasn't working, covering my walls with pieces because I couldn't afford canvases for everything. After 4 months, Veronica asked if she could display some of my drawings in the store. She had empty wall space and thought they'd fit the aesthetic. I was terrified to put my work up publicly, remembering my dad burning my portfolio, but I agreed. She hung 6 charcoal drawings near the register. They were studies of hands, faces, architectural details from around the city. I didn't expect anything to come from it. They were just drawings filling empty walls. A woman came in 2 weeks later and stood in front of my drawings for 20 minutes. She introduced herself as Simone Beaumont, owner of a contemporary art gallery 3 blocks away. She asked who the artist was, and Veronica pointed at me folding shirts in the corner. Simone studied my face, then looked back at the drawings. She asked if I had more work. I told her about the paintings covering my studio walls because I couldn't afford to frame them properly. She said she wanted to see them. I brought Simone to my apartment the next day, embarrassed by the roaches and peeling paint. She didn't care about the space. She walked around my studio looking at every piece, and I watched her face change. She saw something in my work that I hadn't been able to articulate. She stopped in front of a large canvas I'd done of the homeless encampment where I'd slept those first weeks. I'd painted it from memory, trying to capture the humanity in faces most people looked away from. The way Raymond's hands shook when he drank his coffee. The gentleness in Alice's eyes despite everything she'd survived. Simone turned to me and said my work had something galleries paid 6 figures for. Raw authenticity mixed with technical skill that usually took decades to develop. She asked where I'd studied, and I told her I'd done 18 months at Wharton before dropping out. No formal art training beyond high school classes I'd taken in secret. She looked shocked, then thoughtful. She said she wanted to represent me, that she could sell my work to serious collectors if I'd let her. I didn't believe her, but I had nothing to lose. We signed a representation agreement in her gallery office. She explained her commission structure and talked about building my portfolio for a show. I felt like I was watching someone else's life. like this couldn't be real. She photographed 20 of my pieces professionally and created a digital portfolio. Then she started showing it to collectors she knew. Within a week, someone bought one of my paintings of the motel for $8,000. I stared at the check when Simone gave me my share, $5,600 after her commission. More money than I'd made in 4 months of day labor combined. Simone sold 3 more pieces in the next month. My style was raw and emotional, showing sides of city life that wealthy collectors found compelling. The irony wasn't lost on me that rich people wanted to buy paintings of poverty, but I needed the money desperately, so I kept painting what I knew: the shelter where I'd eaten meals, the day labor office where I'd stood in line at dawn, the faces of people society ignored. Each piece sold for more than the last. After 6 months, my paintings were going for $30,000 each. I moved to a better apartment, bought real art supplies, quit the clothing store to paint full-time. Simone booked me a solo show at her gallery for the following spring. She said we needed to build anticipation, get my name circulating in the right circles. I spent 8 months creating new work, pushing myself technically and emotionally. The show was called Invisible City, focusing on the Philadelphia homeless population I'd lived among. 30 pieces ranging from intimate portraits to large-scale scenes of encampments and shelters. The opening night was overwhelming. 200 people packed into Simone's gallery, drinking wine and examining my work like it hung in a museum. Art critics from major publications showed up. Collectors I'd never heard of asked detailed questions about my process and inspiration. By the end of the night, 23 pieces had sold. The prices ranged from $45,000 to $85,000. After Simone's commission, I'd made over $900,000 in one evening. I couldn't process it. A year ago, I'd been sleeping in a park. Now I had almost $1 million, and critics were calling me the most exciting new artist in contemporary American realism. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a feature about me with photos of my work. New York Magazine included me in a roundup of emerging artists to watch. My Instagram following went from 300 to 30,000 overnight. Galleries in New York, Los Angeles, and London reached out through Simone asking about availability. That's when my dad found out. My brother Ethan saw the article in the Inquirer and sent it to him, thinking it might make him proud. Instead, my dad called Simone's gallery pretending to be a potential collector. He asked detailed questions about me and my background, trying to figure out if this was really his son who was supposed to be failing miserably. When he confirmed it was me, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. I'd moved to a nicer place in Fishtown, a 1-bedroom with actual heat and no roaches. I was home painting when someone buzzed my apartment aggressively. I checked the video intercom and saw my dad standing outside. He was in a suit, looking exactly like he had the day he cut me off. My hands started shaking. I almost didn't let him up, but some part of me needed to face him. I buzzed him in and opened my door, watching him climb the stairs. He walked into my apartment, and I could see him cataloging everything. The canvases stacked against walls, the quality of my furniture, the expensive easel and professional lighting I'd bought. His face was hard to read, cycling between anger and something else I couldn't identify. He said he'd seen the article about my show, about the prices my work was selling for. He'd done research and discovered I was being collected by major museums, that galleries in 3 countries wanted to represent me. I didn't say anything, just stood there waiting. He asked why I hadn't contacted the family after I'd clearly succeeded. I told him he'd burned my portfolio and said I was dead to him, that he'd made everyone block my number and turned my mother against me, that I'd been homeless and terrified while he was living in his mansion. He waved that away like it was irrelevant, ancient history. He said families had disagreements, but blood was blood, that he was proud of what I'd accomplished and wanted to help me manage my success. The word help made my stomach turn. I asked what he thought he could possibly help with. He said I clearly needed financial advisors, lawyers, people who understood complex money management. He ran a $300 million company. He could introduce me to the right people, make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of by gallery owners or hangers-on. He could help me turn this art success into a real empire. I realized he wasn't here to apologize. He was here because I'd proven valuable despite his predictions, and he wanted to control the situation. This was a business negotiation to him, not a reconciliation with the son he'd abandoned. I told him to leave. He looked genuinely surprised, like he couldn't understand why I wouldn't want his help. He said I was being emotional and immature, that I should think about this logically. Smart people accepted help from successful people. I opened my door and told him again to leave. He didn't move. He said we should discuss this like adults, that throwing away family connections over pride was foolish. I grabbed my phone and told him if he didn't leave immediately, I'd call the police. He finally walked to the door, but stopped in the doorway. He said I'd regret this, that I'd come running back once I realized how hard it was to sustain success without proper guidance, that the art world would chew me up and spit me out within a year. I closed the door in his face and locked it. I called Simone immediately and told her what happened. She said we needed to protect me legally, that family who showed up after success often caused problems. She connected me with an entertainment lawyer named David Reeves, who'd worked with artists dealing with complicated family situations. I met with him the next day. David listened to everything, from the portfolio burning to my dad's unexpected visit, and said we needed to establish boundaries immediately with legal backing. David drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It stated that my father had severed our relationship completely when he cut me off, that he'd taken deliberate actions to destroy my art and my life, and that I wanted no contact. If he continued attempting to insert himself into my career, I'd pursue a restraining order. He had no legal claim to anything I'd created or earned after he disowned me. David sent it certified mail to my dad's office and his home. My dad responded by calling my mother for the first time in months. She'd been quietly following my success online, liking Instagram posts from a fake account she thought I didn't know about. When my dad realized I was serious about cutting him out, he tried using her as a mediator. She called me crying, saying she'd made a mistake not standing up for me before, that she wanted to be part of my life again. I asked if Dad had told her to call. She went quiet, then admitted he'd suggested she reach out. I told her I loved her, but I couldn't trust her. She'd chosen him over me when I needed her most. She'd let me leave with garbage bags of clothes and never called to check if I was alive. She'd enabled every cruel thing he'd done because it was easier than standing up to him. Now she wanted back in, because I'd succeeded despite them. She said that wasn't fair, that she'd been in an impossible position. I said she'd had choices and she'd made them. Then I hung up. My younger brother Ethan reached out next. He was 20 now, finishing up at Penn, following the exact path my dad had laid out. He sent a long text apologizing for blocking me back then, saying he'd been too scared to help, but that he regretted it. He said my success proved Dad wrong, and he was proud of me. He wanted to meet for coffee and rebuild our relationship. I read it 3 times, trying to decide if I believed him. We met at a cafe near his campus. Ethan looked older, more stressed than I remembered. He talked about the pressure Dad put on him, how every decision was scrutinized and criticized. He said watching my success from a distance had made him question everything about the path he was on. He asked detailed questions about how I'd survived after being cut off, and I gave him the abbreviated version: the homelessness, the day labor, sleeping in my car until Dad had it towed. He looked genuinely horrified. Then he admitted Dad had asked him to convince me to reconcile, that Dad wanted to be involved in my career and thought I'd listen to Ethan when I wouldn't listen to him. Ethan said he'd agreed to try because he actually did want a relationship with me, but he wanted me to know Dad was pulling strings. I appreciated the honesty. I told Ethan I'd be open to rebuilding our relationship, but only if he could be independent from Dad's influence. He said he'd try, though we both knew it wouldn't be easy. Simone booked me a show in New York 2 months later at a prestigious gallery in Chelsea. The owner had been tracking my work since the Philadelphia show and wanted to introduce me to the New York collector base. I created 12 new pieces for it, moving beyond homelessness into broader themes of American class disparity. I painted corporate offices next to food banks, luxury apartments next to homeless encampments, the visible wealth gap that most people pretended not to see. The New York opening was even bigger than Philadelphia. The gallery was enormous, 3 floors of white walls and perfect lighting. Collectors flew in from Los Angeles, Miami, London. Museum curators showed up with acquisition budgets. By the end of opening night, all 12 pieces had sold. The prices had climbed again. My large-scale works were going for $120,000 each. The smaller pieces sold for $60,000 to $80,000. After the gallery's commission, I'd made close to $900,000 in one evening for the second time. A reporter from Art Forum interviewed me that night. She asked about my background and training, and I gave her the truthful version. Wharton dropout, disowned by my wealthy father, 18 months homeless and working day labor, taught myself to paint in stolen hours. She asked if my father had seen my success, and I said yes, but we were estranged. She pushed for details, sensing a story. I kept it vague, saying some families didn't understand artistic pursuits. The article ran 3 weeks later with the headline, "From Homelessness to High Art, How Maxwell Dempsey Turned Poverty into Six-Figure Paintings. It was a 6-page spread with photos of my work and quotes from major collectors explaining why they'd paid so much. The piece detailed my father's real estate empire and his rejection of my artistic ambitions. It quoted unnamed sources saying my father had burned my early work and deliberately made me homeless. The contrast between his wealth and my suffering made compelling reading. That article got picked up everywhere. The New York Times ran a follow-up. The Washington Post did a profile. NPR interviewed me for their arts program. Suddenly, I wasn't just a rising artist. I was a symbol of rejecting family expectations and succeeding against the odds. Art students reached out saying I'd inspired them to pursue their work despite family pressure. People shared the articles with comments about their own difficult parents and choosing unconventional careers. My dad lost his mind. The publicity was humiliating for him in his social circles. His friends and business associates were reading about how he'd disowned his son and made him homeless for wanting to paint. The articles made him look cruel and short-sighted, especially now that my work was selling for 6 figures. He started calling me directly, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading. I didn't respond to any of them. He escalated by calling Simone's gallery. He told her staff he was my father and demanded she stop representing me because I was mentally unwell, that I'd misrepresented our family situation to make him look bad. Simone recorded the call and sent it to David, my lawyer. David added it to the file we were building. He said if my dad kept harassing my professional contacts, we'd have enough for a restraining order. Then my dad tried a different approach. He hired a private investigator to dig into my finances and relationships. The investigator contacted people I knew, asking questions about my lifestyle and spending habits. He interviewed Veronica at the vintage store, asking if I'd ever seemed unstable or dishonest. He tracked down Raymond, the veteran who'd helped me when I was homeless, and asked if I'd exaggerated my experiences. People started calling me worried about a man asking invasive questions. David filed for a restraining order. We included everything: the burned portfolio, the cease and desist letter, the harassment calls to Simone, the private investigator. We requested that my father stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my professional contacts. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. My dad hired expensive lawyers who argued I was being vindictive against a father who just wanted to reconnect with his successful son. I testified about the day he burned my portfolio, about sleeping in my car until he had it towed, about the 18 months I spent homeless and terrified while he lived 20 minutes away in his mansion. I brought the texts from my brother showing my dad had ordered the whole family to cut contact. I played Simone's recording of him demanding she stop representing me. The judge listened to everything carefully, taking notes. My dad's lawyers argued this was a family disagreement being blown out of proportion, that cutting off an adult child wasn't abuse. It was tough love meant to teach responsibility, that my dad had every right to try reconnecting after I'd succeeded. The judge asked my dad directly if he'd burned my art portfolio. My dad admitted he had, but said it was to shock me into taking life seriously. The judge asked if he'd known I was homeless. My dad said he'd assumed I'd figure things out, that I'd always been resourceful. The judge granted the restraining order. She said my dad's actions showed a pattern of control and punishment, not love or concern. That showing up only after I'd become financially successful suggested opportunistic motives rather than genuine reconciliation. The restraining order required him to stay away from me and cease all contact, direct or indirect. If he violated it, he'd face criminal charges. My dad stood up in court and said I'd regret this, that I was turning my back on family and I'd end up alone despite my success. The judge told him he was dangerously close to contempt and ordered him to sit down. He left the courthouse surrounded by his lawyers, and I left with David. I felt relieved, but also empty. I'd legally severed ties with the person who'd raised me, and there was no going back from that. The restraining order made news because my dad was a prominent businessman. Local media covered it with headlines about family estrangement and toxic parents. Some people praised me for setting boundaries. Others criticized me for cutting off my father when he'd clearly provided for me growing up. The comment sections were vicious, debating whether I was brave or ungrateful. I stopped reading them after a few days. My art career continued climbing. Simone booked me shows in London and Los Angeles. Museums started acquiring my pieces for their permanent collections. The Museum of Modern Art bought one of my Homeless series paintings for their contemporary wing. The prices kept rising. Within 2 years of my first solo show, my work was selling for $200,000 per piece. I'd become one of the most commercially successful artists under 30. The financial success was surreal. I hired a wealth manager to handle my money properly. I bought a house in Philadelphia with a separate studio building in the backyard. I set up a foundation that funded art programs in underserved schools. I donated to homeless shelters and day labor organizations. I tried to channel my success into helping people who were where I'd been. It felt important to use the money meaningfully, rather than just accumulating it. My mother reached out one more time, not calling, but sending a handwritten letter. She said she understood why I couldn't trust her, that she'd failed me when I needed her most. She wasn't asking for reconciliation or access to my life. She just wanted me to know she was sorry, that watching me succeed despite everything made her proud and ashamed simultaneously. She said she'd respected my boundaries and wouldn't contact me again. The letter sat on my kitchen table for weeks. I read it multiple times, feeling complicated emotions I couldn't untangle. I decided to write back. I told her the truth about those 18 months of homelessness, the fear, the humiliation, the nights I'd seriously considered giving up. I explained that I couldn't have a relationship with her because she'd chosen Dad over me when it mattered most, and I didn't trust that wouldn't happen again. But I appreciated the apology, and I hoped she found peace with her choices. I mailed it and felt the weight of closure. Ethan and I maintained a careful relationship. We'd meet for coffee every few months when he wasn't too deep in Dad's business. He'd started working for the company after graduation, following the path I'd rejected. He seemed quietly miserable, but unable to imagine another life. I tried not to push him, knowing he had to make his own decisions. He said Dad never mentioned me anymore, had essentially erased me from family history. 3 years after the restraining order, my work was featured in a major retrospective at the Whitney Museum in New York. It was a huge honor, the kind of institutional recognition that cemented an artist's career. The show included 50 pieces spanning my entire body of work, from those early drawings at the motel to my latest large-scale installations. The opening was attended by everyone who mattered in the art world. I heard through Ethan that my dad had seen the exhibition announcement, that he'd wanted to attend, but the restraining order prevented him from being within 500 feet of me. Ethan said Dad had stood outside the museum on opening night, watching people go in, unable to enter. Part of me felt satisfied by that image. He'd burned my portfolio and told me I'd fail. Now my work hung in one of the most prestigious museums in America, and he couldn't even see it. The validation from the art world was incredible, but the real satisfaction came from helping other artists. I started a grant program for artists from low-income backgrounds, giving them stipends to create work without financial pressure. I funded studio spaces and supplies. I used my platform to highlight other artists who'd struggled with family rejection or poverty. The success felt meaningless if I kept it entirely for myself. I ran into Veronica, the vintage store owner who'd given me a job, at an art opening in Philadelphia. She hugged me tight and said she'd followed everything, that she was proud, but not surprised. She'd known I had talent when I was folding shirts in her store. I told her she'd saved my life by giving me that job, that I wouldn't have survived without her kindness. She said that's what people who'd walked similar paths did for each other. We stayed in touch after that, meeting for coffee monthly to talk about art and life. Raymond, the veteran who'd shown me how to survive homelessness, reached out through social media. He'd seen articles about me and wanted to tell me he was doing better. He'd gotten into transitional housing and was working on his sobriety. I met him for lunch, and we talked about those early days. He said he'd always known I'd get out of that situation, that I'd had a drive most homeless people lost. I told him he'd taught me survival skills I still used, ways of being resourceful that served me in the art world. 5 years after being cut off, I was established enough that my success wasn't questioned anymore. I'd proven I could sustain a career, that this wasn't a fluke. My work sold consistently at major auctions. Galleries competed to represent new pieces. I'd been profiled in every major art publication. The narrative of my background, the rejection and homelessness, had become part of my artistic identity. People saw my work as more authentic because of what I'd survived to create it. My dad's real estate empire started having problems. Bad investments, shifting markets, and partners who'd read about his family situation and quietly distanced themselves. His reputation took hits he couldn't quite recover from. I heard through Ethan that Dad blamed me, said the negative publicity from our estrangement had damaged his business relationships, that if I'd just handled things privately, instead of getting restraining orders and talking to press, everything would be fine. Ethan called me one evening sounding stressed. He said Dad had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, that the doctors expected decline over the next 5 to 10 years. Dad was already showing memory problems and personality changes. Ethan said Dad had asked about me, confused about why I wasn't around. Ethan wasn't sure if Dad actually wanted reconciliation, or if the disease was just making him forget our estrangement. He asked if I wanted to know. I thought about it for days. Part of me felt satisfied that Dad would decline while I continued succeeding. Another part felt sad that this would be the end of his story, forgetting everything including the son he'd destroyed. I told Ethan to keep me updated, but that I wouldn't be visiting. I'd made my peace with our relationship ending. Disease didn't change what had happened or make those wounds heal. 6 months later, Ethan called again. Dad had gotten significantly worse. Didn't recognize him half the time. Mom was overwhelmed trying to care for him. Ethan had started therapy to deal with his own complicated feelings about watching Dad fade. He said the person declining wasn't really the same person who'd cut me off. That disease had erased so much of who Dad had been. I listened, but didn't change my position. The restraining order was still active. I wasn't going back. I focused on my work instead. I started a series about generational trauma and family dysfunction. The pieces were darker than my usual style, exploring the psychological weight of rejection and the scars left by conditional love. Critics called it my most mature work, evidence of emotional depth beyond technical skill. The series sold out before the show even opened. Each piece went for over $250,000. My mother sent one final letter. She said Dad was in memory care now, that he'd declined to the point where he needed full-time professional help. She wasn't asking me to visit or reconcile. She just wanted me to know, in case it mattered. She said she understood the choices I'd made and respected them. She hoped I was happy and at peace with my life. The letter felt like a real goodbye this time, acknowledgement that our family had fractured beyond repair. 7 years after that day in Dad's office where he burned my portfolio, I got a call from Ethan. Dad had passed away in the memory care facility. The disease had taken him gradually, erasing memories and personality until there was almost nothing left. Ethan said the funeral would be small and private. He wasn't expecting me to come, but he wanted me to know. I thanked him for calling, and we talked for a few minutes about memories from childhood, back before everything had fallen apart. I didn't attend the funeral. I'd said my goodbyes years ago when the restraining order became final. Instead, I spent that day in my studio painting. I created a piece about closure and complicated grief, about mourning the father I'd needed rather than the father I'd had. It was one of my most personal works, and I kept it for myself instead of selling it. Some pieces weren't meant for galleries. A decade after being disowned, I'm one of the most successful contemporary artists working today. My pieces sell for $300,000 and up at auction. I've had retrospectives at major museums worldwide. Art history professors teach classes about my work. Young artists cite me as an influence. The success is everything my dad said I'd never achieve, everything he tried to prevent by burning my portfolio and making me homeless. The sweet justice is that my success happened specifically because he rejected me, because surviving that rejection gave me something authentic to paint. I still think about that day sometimes, watching my work burn while he told me I was dead to him. The ash rising up the chimney, years of drawings disappearing in minutes. The absolute certainty he had that I'd fail without his guidance and money. The contempt in his voice when he said art was for people who couldn't hack real careers. He was wrong about everything, and he died knowing it. That has to count for something.